Hi, Leighton. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. Good to talk to you, Jenna.
Yeah, it's so nice to see you. I have not seen you or played with you in many a months, like
Yeah,
6+ months, I
it's
think, at
been a
this point.
while. It's been too long,
I
too
know,
long.
right? Where are you zooming from?
Just my apartment in Toronto. I'm in the annex.
So I'm really excited to jump into conversation with you. I have so many questions for you, and I feel like as I was preparing for this conversation, I realized that I really have not had a chance to really dig into bass in
Right.
jazz. And I know that bass is important. I know what bass generally does. I know how I feel when I play with bass. I know how that makes the ensemble feel. But it was really a privilege to be able to really sit there and think about what questions can I ask Leighton, who is just ready to answer bass related and life related questions. So I'm really excited to jump in.
All right. Me too. I can't wait. It's my favorite thing. One of my favorite things to talk about. So,
Amazing. Okay, so you and I have performed together, we've rehearsed together, we've jammed together, we've done a bunch of playing together all over the city. And as a result, we have also TTC together a bunch of times. We've been on the subway together, we've been on the night bus together after a gig. And so there's no secret that when you bring your upright bass, which is a massive physical instrument, people give you the stares. They come up to you and ask about the bass, or they think it's a cello all the time. They want to discuss with you. Like, it's just a huge instrument physically. And so I just can't help but start the conversation by asking you, what is your double bass, upright bass story? How
sure.
in the world did young Leighton decide I'm going to play this gigantic upright bass?
Yeah. Well, where to begin? I mean, uh, yeah. So my mom made me take orchestra class in middle school, and I was like really hesitant. Like I was really resistant to it. Like at first, and then I was like cool with it for a little bit, and then like I later became like kind of resentful and like I didn't like it again. But in like fifth grade, I was going to my middle school that I was going to attend the next year had like an open house, and my mom was like, "Okay, we're going to the orchestra class. You're gonna like find the instrument that you want to play." And I was like, I saw like violin, viola, cello, and I was like interested in I guess like all of them, but I was like kind of tall. Like I've been like over 6 feet tall since like sixth grade. Like so I've been like kind of a big like tall guy um like my whole life. And so I was like kind of concerned that if I were to play violin or viola or cello, those were the other instruments available to me in the orchestra class. I was concerned that my hands would be too big to like play them. That was like so that was part of it. I was like, well, I don't. And also part of it was like, I was concerned like it's a little vain, but I was like concerned with like how I would look holding like a small violin or something. I was like, oh, I don't know. Like I don't want to be this big guy and have this like little instrument and the cello. Like I don't know about the cello. So I just decided kind of in that moment that I was going to play the bass because it was like cool, and also like I wasn't really aware of like a lot of music, um like live music. Like I wasn't like, yeah, I didn't really play piano. Like I hadn't really had any musical training at that point. And
Wow,
so
so you started playing music by learning how to play the upright bass?
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
And I kind of yeah, it's a bit of a different experience because especially like if you get it like start going to music school and stuff like that, as you and I both have, like you find out that like it seems like almost everybody like started playing piano when they were like 6, and I like just that was not my experience at all. Yeah, I started playing music. Oh, actually, okay, that's like kind of like I was in choir in church, which I guess
Nice.
is important, but I wasn't like super like into it. I would like skip rehearsal. I like when like honestly when I started playing bass, I was like 11. I was interested in like playing lacrosse and skateboarding. Those were like my two like 11-year-old interests. But I like so yeah, I started playing the bass. I guess I was 11 in orchestra class, and I just like really wasn't like super into it. I remember enjoying it, and I remember thinking like I have this instrument next to me, and it makes me look cool. Um, but I didn't really like get into. I remember like that summer, the summer after grade six, we took the bass home for the summer, and I was like, I'm not touching that. I'm gonna like play Call of Duty. I'm gonna play basketball with my brother. I maybe like picked up the bass like three times that entire. Like I didn't practice. I was like just super not into it. And the following year, I begged my mother because there was like a really good lacrosse team that I was like that I wanted to try out for, and so I was like, I don't want, man, like I don't want to do anything else. I just like lacrosse or nothing. And I was like, Mom, like, can I quit orchestra basically? And she was like, no, like I refuse, like absolutely not. And I was like, I so mad at her. I was like, oh man, like my mom, she doesn't get it, man. Like this isn't me. Like, yeah, I was just like so like furious, or like, I mean, like, I didn't like yell at her or anything. It wasn't like that bad, but I was like, I couldn't get it. I was like, why are you making me do this thing I hate? And then so fast forward to like high school.
And to be clear, just before you get to this point, this has
Mhm.
all been classical bass up until what maybe later on in your story, but to this
Yeah.
point, it's all classical
Yes.
orchestral bass.
Yeah, it's all like classical, and yeah, it's basically all been. And I never took private lessons or anything like that until high school. But like, yeah, it was all like kind of classical or like classical-ish because a lot of that like middle school orchestra material, and it's awesome to like get young kids playing this music.
That was going to be my next comment. Wow, like the fact that you had a program in school where you could play orchestral music and like have
Yeah,
access to an upright bass to bring home. That's amazing. That's rare, you know?
yeah, we were really lucky. The public school system in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I grew up, is actually has just like I mean, it's it's getting harder now, and there are challenges, especially recently. But it's historically had like really good arts funding at some of the schools. So yeah, I was really lucky. At the time, I didn't think I was lucky, but I was actually really fortunate in that sense to be getting that. It
Yeah.
was pretty much an hour a day of
Wow.
like playing the bass. And then I got to high school, and I actually by that time I was like still really into sports, and I was playing football and lacrosse. And so my ninth grade year, I actually took orchestra only for one semester, and then yeah, I just like wasn't into it. And then all of a sudden, like the end of 10th grade, I made a bunch of friends kind of randomly who were like all jazz musicians. Like it was like really weird. I don't really know how. Um, it's like still kind of mysterious to me. I think I'm a
Destiny.
yeah, like I'm like totally like I'm a bit of like a religious guy, and like I think it's like definitely some like there's just something really deep that I will never understand about like that summer meeting these people. But anyway, so I started playing in addition to playing like that was I never had like any jazz lessons or anything. But I started playing jazz with my friends, and I like they just knew some tunes, and I also started playing like fusion. Like I started playing electric bass at that time, so it was just all of a sudden I went from my relationship with music went from being this thing that was like only in school and only music that I couldn't like really relate to being like all of a sudden it's like a bunch of other 15-year-olds that were like into playing music, and from there I kind of like I quit playing sports.
Wow.
I started taking classical bass lessons, and at first I was like I had this like inner turmoil. I was like like I don't know if I want to be a classical bassist or a jazz bassist, but then just by by playing with my friends like all the time, we would just hang out and play music, and we probably sounded like really bad, but I mean, like, we were 15 and like, who cares? Um, so yeah, we just like played a lot of music that summer, and going into the next years, I was just like, okay, this is like what I want to do. I don't really know the path forward, but I'll figure that out as I go. And I actually ended up transferring high schools for my last year of high school to go to a high school with like just basically a better music program. It had like a symphony orchestra class, so it had like the full
What?
kind of, yeah. It
Wow.
was like really, it was really incredible, and we had two. So I did that one, yeah. So I did that class, and then my two other music classes I took at that high school were like jazz combo and big band. So it was like I was just really, really lucky to have transferred there, because that's where all my friends that I met at the end of 10th grade went. And so I already had like that network. I was like, okay, man, like this is the place for me. And I was lucky enough to get the transfer, and it worked out. But yeah, I'm really grateful for like really, really awesome arts education in Wake County, North Carolina, where I grew up, because I wouldn't be playing the bass without it. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but
No,
that's
I love it. I'm so glad I asked you that because I did not know that about you at all. That is
mm,
very cool. And I can't help but ask you now, just to continue on the path of this conversation,
sure.
how does one go from, first you're playing kind of orchestral bass, classical bass, taking classical bass lessons, you said,
Hmm.
then you transferred to a high school where you can play in jazz combo and you can play in big band. And
Hmm.
then how did you in North Carolina playing in these high school bands and originally, playing classical, how did
Yeah,
you end up coming to Toronto? Because Leighton and I
yeah,
met at the University of Toronto studying jazz.
that's right. Um, okay, it's kind of a funny story. My mom is Canadian, and we grew up like visiting Canada all the time, visiting like Southern Ontario. My mom's from like the Niagara region. And I had like never been to Toronto, and I was like in 11th grade. I had like just started getting really into the bass, and I had just started taking classical lessons. And I was like, I just like one day we were actually on our way to the beach. Like North Carolina is like a coastal state, and there's beaches there. So it's just like a summer activity, you know. It's hard to imagine right now going to the beach because of the pandemic, but
Yeah.
before. Um, and I remember Googling, I was like, I wonder if there's a university in Toronto, because I just like had no idea, because I'd never been to Toronto. And okay, so I like Google University Toronto, University of Toronto. I was like, I wonder if there's a jazz program there, like, because whatever, like. And so I Googled it, and lo and behold, there was that old archaic U of T jazz website that is now something else. It was very of its time. This was I guess 4 or 5 years ago when I was googling this, and then from there I was looking at the faculty, and I was like, I was like, I loved Oscar Peterson. I still do, but like at that time, like my very formative, like probably the first jazz records I fell in love with were like those of the Oscar Peterson trio. And I saw that Dave Young, who teaches bass at the University of Toronto, was in the Oscar Peterson trio in the 80s and 90s. And then I saw that, and I was just like, whoa, like I got to check this out.
Heavy, yeah, it's
Yeah,
cool.
yeah. I was just like, and so then I, like did some digging around the site, and I found, I think Terry Promain was the director of the program at that time, and I
Mhm.
found his email, and I emailed him, and I was like, "Hey, Mr. Promain, this, that, and the other. I'm like, I explained who I was, and I was like, does Dave Young, like, would he be interested in like teaching a lesson? I'm going to be in Ontario from these dates, and I can come to Toronto basically anytime." I came up on my fall break. Um, and then he forwarded the email to Dave, and Dave was like, "Yeah, absolutely, sure." And so
Oh,
fast forward 3 or 4 months, and I went, and I got the lesson, and I was like, he was like very honest with me about where I was in my development, which I was greatly appreciative of. And then basically 2 years later, I kind of used I every break I had, we would go to Canada, and every break I had, I would try to get a lesson with him. So that fall break, that was my first one, and then I went again that winter, and then I didn't go the summer, but then my grade 12 year, that fall break, I went again, and then that winter, I auditioned. So, but I used those lessons kind of as like, okay, like he said, I was like, the word he used was like very raw, in my first lesson, and he was like, I was like, okay, he said that in my first lesson, so hopefully this time it'll be like a little less raw or whatever. But I kind of use those lessons every 3 or 4 months as like motivation to like try and get better. And then ultimately I was accepted in the program and I studied with him for 2 years. So
That's awesome.
that's
I
my
think
youth.
that he just retired this last spring, so
That's
it's
right.
great that you had the opportunity to study with him and have
Yeah.
that experience with him. That's pretty cool, right? Right at the
Yeah.
end of
I'm
the
really
teaching career.
grateful.
So I have some more base specific questions to ask
Ooh.
you, Leighton. The first thing is that I personally feel like bass is very underrated, at least in popular music and like general, society and conversations around music,
Sure.
like especially in popular music where we often talk about the vocalist,
Right.
maybe like, a really cool guitarist or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when I went to music school, I very quickly learned that bass has one of the most important roles in a jazz ensemble, in the jazz setting. And so I'm curious, in general terms, for our audience, can you tell us what the role of the bass is in jazz and why it's so important?
Yeah. I'll preface this by saying I don't think I need to preface it, but this is like my opinion, and I don't want to be dogmatic and say that this is the role of the bass all the time. But in my experience, and like from what I've been taught and from what I hear in music, I guess like the role of the bass is, I guess like to propel the music rhythmically and I guess harmonically. Like just kind of almost to keep the music moving. It's kind of like those old trains, how like the wheels had I don't know what it's called, but the thing that goes like
Yeah.
with the wheel. So I think that's kind of like what our job is to keep the wheels moving of the music, both rhythmically and harmonically, and melodically. I think that bass lines, are melodies, or can be counter melodic. I mean, like, so yeah, I think that really it's like to kind of keep the music moving and to keep the music going forward. So I think what that means, like practically, is kind of over the past 120-ish years that people have been playing the music in this way, the bass instrument, whether it's the upright bass or the tuba, or I mean, I think those are the main two, but I don't like. I'm sure there have been other bass type instruments played. It's kind of like through like the rhythmic thing, it's like almost percussive, right? And I mean, I think yeah, we maybe can talk about that a little more later if there's more specific questions. But like the kind of percussive attack of like the quarter note, as a bassist, I think really is um, a super huge element of like the rhythmic propulsion in this music. And I mean, I had a lesson. I've been fortunate to study sometimes with this great bass player named Rodney Whitaker, and one thing that he said to me was just that, like bass playing harmonically is voice leading. So it's just leading, kind of outlining the harmony. Um, yeah. So like in that voice leading is its own kind of propulsion harmonically in music.
What I think is pretty cool is when I was in jazz school, specifically, I did my small ensemble with Steve Wallace for one
Right.
year, who,
Yes.
is the Canadian, one of the, Canadian icons of jazz playing, let's say.
Absolutely.
And because he's a bass player and he was teaching the class, it was like I got a lot of insight as to, what bass is like and what, from
Right.
a pro, seasoned pro, and what that's all about. And One thing that interests me is that relationship between the drums and the bass,
Mm-hmm.
and how you're both kind of navigating time together. But I'm under the impression that the bass is really like the base of that. Like, and what I'm just curious about, like, what is this thing that you're calling time and this like forward motion? Like, do you feel when things are, when we say in jazz, dragging? Like, how do you feel it in your core? Is it a feeling like the melody's not keeping up? Like, how do you keep it going forward?
uh, well, I think that you have like I think that really like familiarity with the way that this music sounds, and like really listening to a ton of records and like playing along to records as a bass player,
Hmm.
it really equips you to be comfortable in a number of scenarios because a mentor of mine always said to me, like, to be a jazz musician you have to be like a historian, which I think is like really true, just in that like the more music you consume and the more music you listen to, and the more sensitively you listen to it, the more aware you are of like nuances in music, and the more and then through that, the more prepared you are, to kind of deal with them in real time should they appear. So to answer the question about dragging, I think that like um, like if you listen, like it's all in the records. Like I think like, and if you listen to like a ton of these great recordings, you'll notice that, like for example, great bass players, from like one of my favorite eras of jazz, like Ray Brown and Paul Chambers play a certain way with other drummers. So Ray Brown and Ed Thigpen, like of the Oscar Peterson trio,
Mm.
when they're playing together, it feels a certain way, and listening closely to it, you can kind of hear the way they both like deal with the time together. And the same can be said, I mean, with Paul Chambers and Jimmy Cobb. Um, Perhaps Paul Chambers is laying back a bit, and Jimmy Cobb probably feels that and is playing a little bit maybe ahead of where the beat is, right? So like the more, but it's just the more you like listen to music, the more I think, and the more you play along to music too, like the more I grab my bass and I play along to these great records, the more I'm like aware of these situations. So when I'm playing with a drummer and maybe the drummer isn't playing the time where I hear it, I know how to like respectfully like assert where I feel the beat is, and where I feel the music needs to go, and vice versa. Perhaps like if the drummer feels like I'm not really doing it, there's certain things that, because we both have listened to a lot of music, there's certain things that I either of us can do to kind of communicate almost where we think the time is. Does that make sense? Like, you know what I mean?
I love that answer. I think that's so interesting. I
Mm.
love that to be a jazz musician, you have to be a historian and
Right.
you listen and you study sonically, and how that
Right.
feels like, not
Absolutely.
just studying in the books. It's like you're listening with open ears and feeling what that feels like, what that movement, what that rhythm, what that groove is really like feeling like in your body.
Mhm.
And then you kind of, and like you're saying, you're studying specific duos of, drum and bass, or, or
Mhm.
trio with, the rhythm ensemble basically. And you're kind
Right.
of getting used to what certain groups sound like. And then yeah, like making your informed decisions based on that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that like you can kind of tell just when somebody has like listened to the same and played along with the same records as you, when you're playing
Cool.
with them, right? Because if I like a certain way of playing and somebody else does, and we both are playing that way, then it's kind of like yeah, it's just like familiarity, I think.
You must have a lot of those moments when you're playing with somebody new who's playing in a certain way, and you just have one of those, like, you look at that person and you're like,
Right.
are you do you listen to this? And they're like, yeah. And you're
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
yeah.
Um, there's
That's
you know there's
cool.
do you know Graham Vallette?
No, I don't.
Okay, he's in his first year in his master's at U of T,
Okay.
or I guess he just finished it. He's a drummer though. And the first time we played together, I don't even know if we had like played a session together before we had a gig. But I had this gig at Poetry Jazz Cafe in Kensington, and my drummer couldn't make it for whatever reason. So I like just by a recommendation, I called him, and that first set was like some of the most fun I've ever had playing music.
Wow.
And we were like talking in the set break, and just like it was like all the same records we had like we really loved. So it's
That's
just
so cool. And I
yeah,
know Graham, he has blonde hair, right?
yep, yep,
Yeah. I'm not very good with names, always with the faces. So
right.
that's pretty cool. I really like that. And I guess at the end of the day, from what you're describing, me as somebody who is not a bass player or a drummer, I think that it comes down to balance, and like there's like a balancing act going on in terms of the
Totally.
time and whether or not you're ahead or the drummer's behind, and you both together can kind of sync up and make those informed decisions together, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's what makes it swing too. The kind of push and I think that's what makes it swing. The kind of push and pull. Yeah, yeah. That's what it's about to me.
That's really cool. So, okay, so before you mentioned playing the quarter note and having, kind of a percussive sound, which relates perfectly to the next question that I really wanted to ask you.
Sure.
And it's a bit of a kind of history question, I guess, in some ways, also a technique question. And
Right.
as I was preparing for this interview with you, this conversation with you, I should say, I realized that I literally don't know the history of the upright bass in jazz at all. I
Right.
embarrassingly, I'm like, wait, where does it come from? Like, how did this happen? How did like upright bass, become like this pinnacle of jazz music and the jazz ensemble? And where does this come from? And so upon doing some research, I learned that the role of the bass in New Orleans was originally played by the tuba or the sousaphone,
Right.
which makes so much sense now that I think about it, in the brass bands and in marches and ragtime in Dixieland. And that only in the 1920s, jazz started going from these kind of marches and the brass band scene to an indoor bar, and at the time brothels, is where people would actually play jazz indoors. And obviously the sousaphone and the tuba were too loud to play in these areas, and so they would play the upright bass, but pre-amplification, now the upright bass is too quiet. And
Right.
so I didn't realize this. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. We need an amp, we need an amp to be able to hear the
Sure.
bass over the piano and over other people playing whatever.
Hmm.
And what I learned is that this is where slap bass comes from,
Yeah.
because you can hear the bass so much louder when you're doing the slap bass. And
Mhm.
obviously there's that percussive element to playing bass if you're adding the slaps. And I'm just so curious to ask you about this,
Yeah.
because I've heard and seen some slap bass going on. I don't hear it very much, but I do hear it in jazz. And I'm just wondering if you could tell me like just a little bit about slap bass. Like, what is the function? Do you play slap bass? Like, how come
Yeah.
some people play it and some people don't in jazz right now? And yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, you hit the nail right on the head when you said, yeah, like originally, like, in, early jazz, like in New Orleans, yeah, cats were playing, with the sousaphone and, marching and doing that thing. And I think a lot of I think modern jazz bassists don't like realize how much of a deep influence that has had on just like the role of the bass in this music.
I know I didn't know. Like
Yeah,
I kind of thought they were separate things in a way, and I learned I couldn't be more wrong.
right. They're super connected. Well, a lot of the old cats like would play both, because
What?
and
What?
a lot of people still do. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't play
Oh,
saxophone, but like, yeah, a lot of the old cats would play upright bass, and they do the slapping thing. Then they'd play sousaphone if they had an outdoor gig. It just meant more work for them, I think. But I'm not like I want to preface this by saying I'm not like an expert. There are some cats that are like really, really, really heavy into the slapping thing and really know the whole history better than I do. But I think yeah, I know enough. Like I mean, it really did start just kind of I guess like as jazz was moving I guess like north, like into Chicago and New York and these areas. I don't think like the kind of cultural context of the music was really like these big parade style, um, like musical events, and I think
Mm.
it was like a lot more clubs and a lot more kind of indoor venues, and that's when the upright started to come in play. But I mean, think about it, like, so we're talking about rhythm sections. You have the loudest instrument, the drums, right next to the quietest instrument, the bass. So
Yeah.
that presents a problem like very quickly, about how the bass is going to be heard, because it's important that the bass is heard, right? So
Yeah, we've established it's a very important
yeah,
role. We need to hear it.
absolutely, absolutely. But yeah, I guess the slapping thing was an answer kind of to that question. And what's interesting to me is just that, like, well, one of the things that's interesting to me is the like most bass players play steel strings now. So it's
Oh.
like, the core of the string is steel and then it's wrapped in more metal. Um, but um, yeah, but like back in the day, the common thing was to play gut strings. So they were like sheep gut, or like they were like animal intestine. And some people
Whoa.
still play these gut strings today, but the tension on them is actually a lot. Um, yeah, the tension's like a lot looser, I guess, for lack of a better term, and so it doesn't damage your hands as much when you like,
Oh.
So that's kind of like also part of, what allows what allowed for like slap bass to be just kind of so accessible, I guess, for lack of a better term. Because to learn to slap on steel strings is kind of painful, and like I mean, I do it sometimes if certain gigs call for it, but it takes a while to develop those calluses, and like, I'm still not really super comfortable slapping on steel strings. But yeah, and it was actually like something that like all bass players kind of learned, like
That was
like
going to be my follow-up question, Leighton, is do you think that someone who picks up jazz bass today should learn how to slap bass or not?
I think it's important. Like, I mean, I'm not like excellent at it. Like, I'm not. I have some friends who are like really great at, like, have gotten just like really really deep into it. I'm not like a slap bass expert. I'm not excellent at it by any means. But I think that, yeah, like you should at least have like a working knowledge of, like, or to me, I think that it's important to have like a working knowledge of that kind of, like, because I think it's like, again, so deeply influential. Like, I mean, yeah, I think it's just so deeply important to kind of bridge that gap and recognize that the sousaphone to the slap bass to like the modern two feel and beyond, it's all super connected. Um, like, uh, for example, like Paul Chambers he's a bass player in the Miles Davis Quintet, the first great quintet. There's a beautiful example of this I was talking about with one of my teachers recently, on the record, Roundabout Midnight, and on the track, Bye Bye Blackbird. Paul Chambers plays. I'm gonna sing terribly, but he plays like the bass line is a two feel, so it's ding, dung, ding, ka dung, gung, ging, gung, ging, gung, 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 or something like that, right? And that's like really important because, like, so that's like a softened up version of like the New Orleans second line type bass line where we ding, dong, ding, dong, ding,
True.
you know what I mean? And it's like really like that's like, okay, so we're 30 years later and in New York, and that's like what but it's lineage, right? It's like history. It's these things are really connected, and so I'm sure, I have no doubt that Paul Chambers, who is responsible for like kind of almost like the like one of the godfathers of like the modern two feel, as we call it in jazz. I'm sure that he knew how to play a slap bass line. You know what I mean? Because I just feel like that's kind of where that came from, and it kind of shaped the direction of where jazz bass has gone and continues to go. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, again, you're just like, you're really setting me up for my questions here, Leighton. I have a very pertinent question to what you just said, and That is, I am really dying to know
Hmm.
how does, for you, in your opinion, how does the study of jazz tradition influence your playing today? How do
Yeah.
you study early jazz music, and how do you apply or not apply that study to your contemporary jazz or modern popular music playing?
Sure. Yeah. So I think like again, echoing the words of a mentor of mine, to be a jazz musician, you have to be a historian. I think that like yeah, like it's really important. I spent a summer like really trying to dig in to like the Louis Armstrong records of the 1930s, like with the Hot Fives and Hot Sevens. There's this great like Spotify collection. It's a collection on Spotify, but it's just called like the Decca singles, and it's like all the singles Louis Armstrong put out on Decca.
Cool.
In like I think there's a couple of them. There's like a couple volumes, but it's like between 1933, 1930, whatever, through the 40s. And I spent a summer, among other things. I was practicing other things, but I was really trying to like just like get into that vibe and like and kind of feel how to play that. And I think that like more than most things I've done has really helped kind of ground my understanding not only of like the music from like a cultural and historical perspective, but also like I think I might butcher it, but there's this quote I think about often where Branford Marsalis, or this story, he's talking about transcribing all these Wayne Shorter solos, and then talking about not getting it, and then he went back and transcribed like a bunch of Lester Young solos, who was like Wayne Shorter's hero, and then he was like, oh man, like this makes sense, like, and I
Wow.
think I have that thing, or I've kind of found that the more I become aware of like the older jazz records, the more that everything else kind of makes sense. And so I think like tradition is this thing, and with each generation we choose which things we're going to continue to uphold, and we also choose which things we're not going to kind of continue in the same way, right? And so I think like even though like most modern jazz bassists like aren't slapping the bass on every tune, I think we're still like deeply influenced by like that kind of tradition of playing has brought to the music. You know, I think it's all really connected in ways that are uh, probably deeper than I can understand at this point. Being like 21 years old and like still relatively new to this music, but I think that I apply it in some ways. Um, I guess like in some ways like explicitly, in some ways implicitly, because I know that music. I know I've spent time with that music. When you spend time like learning how those cats played, and Milt Hinton, and sorry, I'm just thinking of more names. Um, it like really, I think it really like can inform and just kind of broaden your horizons in ways you wouldn't expect. And so I think it's like really important to me, to my personal jazz study, I guess, to dig into those older records and love them, because they're so like beautiful to me. It's just fun to listen to. So I don't know. I think it's super important, and if you want to be like a jazz musician, I think it's really important to know the whole history.
Yeah.
Just like if you wanna be a funk musician, I think it's really important to learn that whole history too. If you want to be a hip hop musician, I think it's really like any kind of music you want to throw yourself into. I think it's really, 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 really important to learn, like to just start from the beginning and really just try to soak up as much information you can. And I think the most important thing that like in American popular music, and basically in North American music, I think the one kind of unifying factor is the blues, and I think that's like uh, kind of the most important thing that anybody wanting to play American music. It doesn't matter if it's like I don't know, like folk, jazz, R&B, hip hop, like any kind of music that from the past 100 years at least, but probably more, that has its origin in North America. I think you can't disconnect that from the blues, and I think that, yeah, I mean, and that is, we have to also acknowledge that that's like a huge musical contribution, by black people who made this music in very hard conditions and very under impossibly difficult conditions, in the United States. And I think that's kind of the common thread of like American music, in my opinion. I can't remember who described it this way, but it kind of stuck with me. But talking about the blues and jazz as music that was made, like joyous music made in like the face of adversity.
Mm.
Um, and I think that's like really true. But in order to like have that joy, I think you have to also understand the adversity and understand that where it's coming from. And sometimes it's not joyous music. Sometimes it's like really a release of, um, a number of things. I mean, it is important to take not only the readily accessible and like really fun parts of this music, of any music. I think it's really important to know kind of that entire thing, and the pain and the oppression, that this music like, was born out of in a lot of ways.
And I'll ask you the next one, and you don't have to answer it if you're not comfortable with answering it. We'll just edit it all out. But I'm just curious from your standpoint, especially as such a young musician in the scene as well. I mean, you said you're 21 years old, right? That's in your, that's pretty young, and that means that you're a part of this really exciting new generation of jazz
Sure.
musicians that will hit the scene, right? And
Yeah.
I'm just curious to know, based on what we're talking about right now, like, do you find that your peers and the people in the general community that you play with, or even that you learn from, do you feel that respect for the history is there? Do you feel it's being respected, being taught, being spoken about, or do you feel like there could be some room for improvement and growth in the community?
Um, I think that's a hard question to answer, but it's a great question. I think that there's definitely room for improvement. There's always room for improvement. I think that like, I've without getting into it, I've run into, like, I've had some experiences that, for lack of a better term, weren't very nice, both in school and out of school, and in Toronto and other places, in regards to this music. I, by my peers and by people who have taught me, and so I think that I think people like want to be aware and want to be, like, generally want to kind of, you know deal with these things in like a real way. I think, yeah, like there are like a lot of issues, and there's like a ton of room to improve, and there's like a lot of work to be done, and people are doing the work. Though I see people doing the work, which is good, and I see people, organizing around, kind of these issues as they relate to music as well, in a way that's inspiring to me. And I feel like that wouldn't have happened like 20 years ago. I feel like it wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. I feel like it wouldn't have even maybe happened like 2 years ago. So I'm like really appreciative of like the energy that I'm seeing. Yeah, I'm just hoping that, you know, it's kept up, and that people, are really committed to this change we're talking about and we're sharing on our Instagram stories and whatnot. I mean, but I think that, like, I am an optimist, and I believe in like that better things will always come, eventually. Uh, so I don't know. Yeah, I'm like generally hopeful. I'm skeptically hopeful. I guess, if that word. Yeah, you know what I mean?
I really appreciate you, taking the energy to answer that question. I think that it's really important to check in, with people, and especially a young, cat on the scene and somebody who's in it.
Sure.
I'm actually very helpful for the young generation. Actually, I feel like people are we're obviously right now, in a civil rights movement of our own in 2020, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I find that the younger jazz musicians, and I'm talking like young, like, 25 and younger, I feel like they are having the conversations. Do you find that?
Yeah, totally. And I think people are, and I think people are like more, I guess, yeah, interested than it seems like ever,
Yeah.
to kind of get at the, yeah. So I think like my peers generally seem to be pretty like interested in talking and working it out and being self-reflective and self-critical, and because we all have room to kind of improve and to be better.
Yeah.
And I think at the same time, people are like really, calling on our institutions and calling into question a lot of the things that we've accepted as perhaps normal or fine. I think that kind of awareness on a less personal and more kind of and on a larger scale, I think people are really, fired up about it. So I'm hoping that, you know, it's only up from here.
Yeah, I hope so too. I definitely hope so. And I think that everybody listening can be a part of this, and should be a part of this conversation and the movement. And I think that if you're complacent, then perhaps you need to do some investigating in yourself. And I should just say ourselves, just to being,
Right.
inclusive, that we all have work to do in all
Certainly.
of us. But yeah, that thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so my final question, and I'm asking everybody to do this, including myself. Everybody involved in today's podcast have chosen 5 tracks, 5 recordings that we will be putting into a Spotify playlist for all of our audience members and listeners to go check out and be inspired by and to enjoy. And I was hoping that you could present the 5 tracks that you've chosen.
Totally. Okay, so yeah, the first one I picked was "Jump for Joy" by the Duke Ellington Orchestra, the Blanton Webster Band. So it was called the Blanton Webster Band because Ben Webster, the famous saxophonist, and Jimmy Blanton, the bass player, really defined the sound of the band in this era. And I think we owe them for like as jazz musicians just for a lot. And I think sometimes they don't get the credit they deserve.
I
So
agree.
yeah. So this track has Ivy Anderson singing "Jump for Joy," and it was actually the first all black musical on Broadway. This song is from that. It's
Wow.
called yeah. It's just called Jump for Joy," um, and I just really love the I was in like a community big band my last year of high school, and Jazz at Lincoln Center in New York does this program where they bring in 15 big bands from around the U.S. to compete in this big band competition, and it's called Essentially Ellington. And what they do is they send out a ton of Duke Ellington's music each year. They transcribe it. They're really great charts. Um, and you play them. And the band that I was in actually had the chance to go, and we competed, and it was
Cool.
an experience. And this is one of the tunes we played. Um, and I think yeah, like like we talked about earlier, the joy in the face of adversity kind of element I think is really apparent in this song, and it's jumping for joy, but it's if you listen to the lyrics, it's like kind of in the context of like some kind of like really heavy topics, like some really heavy stuff relating to just being black in the early 20th century. So yeah, but I really love the song, and the bass playing's like awesome. Yeah, so that's just yeah, it's just one of my favorite recordings.
Cool.
Um, the next one is Visitation by Paul Chambers. Um, so Paul Chambers, great bass player, grew up in Philly, or sorry, not Philly, sorry, not Philly. He grew up in Detroit. He grew up in Detroit. I apologize to any if there's anyone from Detroit listening. I'm really sorry that I said that. It was a slip. Yeah, sorry, Paul Chambers, PC. He grew up in Detroit. And is I guess he was 20. He was my age. He was like 21 when he
Wow.
recorded this, and it's just an example of incredible bass playing. He sounds, beyond his years on this recording. It's just really, to me, I hear so much love in Paul Chambers' bass playing. He's so expressive through the instrument, both in like his unique note choice and his like really beautiful sound. And the blues element, like the blues just so, like comes through so strongly in this recording. And I think that he's just like a really masterful bass player, and I don't know. It's hard to talk about music, right? But this recording and this album really touched me, and so does Paul Chambers. So I had to kind of put this on the list. It's him basically a song he wrote, and it's just what like kind of a big long bass solo. So I hope you enjoy that one.
Awesome.
The third one is Blues on the Corner by McCoy Tyner, and it's from his 1963 album The Real McCoy, um, which I think is like so hip that he used that play on words because like oh it's the real McCoy. That was like a saying back in like the I guess probably like World War I era, like and it just meant kind of like the bee's knees, like
I
something like
didn't know that. That's
yeah,
cool.
yeah. So he it's like a play on words there, the real McCoy.
Smart.
But yeah, Blues on the Corner. I think this is like a really cool track just because it gets into kind of some um like it's very much the blues, and yet there's this kind of um I'd hate to say like modern because that word doesn't really describe anything, but for lack of a better term, this kind of like uh language that hadn't been heard in jazz really at this time yet. And this album just kind of like is just really incredible for that because it's like all of this cool new hip language like rooted in the blues, which I just think is like I don't know, it's just a great record to me. Yeah, the the next one I picked was Nicholas Payton is this like awesome trumpet player, and among other things that I just really admire, and I think he was close to my age when he came out with this record, Gumbo Nouveau. He's a great trumpet player from New Orleans, and this track "When the Saints Go Marching In," it's like a really beautiful modern kind of take on like a really familiar and tune with a lot of deep history and cultural connection to New Orleans. Um, and one thing that Nick Payton said is that like he plays postmodern New Orleans music. Like that's what he calls his music. And so if it's like I think kind of like the metaphor then follows like if the original recordings, like if Louis Armstrong's version of When the Saints Go Marching In was like classical New Orleans music, then his is like the postmodern version. And so it gets into some just like really beautiful harmony, and the arrangement is amazing. And I think that yeah, it's just I mean it's awesome. The record came out in the 90s, so it's relatively recent. But yeah, it's just kind of incredible to me. So I hope you enjoy that one also, whoever's listening. Um, and then the last one I picked was Ask Me Now from, I think, like, yeah, the 2018 record by Walter Smith III entitled Twio, which it's a trio, but he was being funny with it and he called it Twio. But I just love, like, so Walter Smith III was like I think, like, is known in like a lot of circles to be I guess like avant-garde would be the word, modern. But he's known to play like a lot of like really like avant-garde music. And this album is like all like jazz standards written by jazz composers, or like songs from the Great American Songbook. And I think it's really cool to hear um, people who wouldn't generally be associated with like the standards tradition, as it were, to be playing like this tune "Ask Me Now," written by Monk, because it pays its respects to that tune and to Thelonious Monk, while also like being very, I guess, hip and modern and of its time. Because again, the record came out in 2018, and the bass player, Harish Raghavan, is just like one of my favorite. I think he's from, I think, Chicago originally, and just really um, it's just really beautiful bass playing. I don't know what else to say. I struggle to find words to talk about music without like getting like intellectual, and that's not really what I like to do when
Just
I talk.
beautiful. It's just
Yeah,
speaks
it's
to
just
you.
fantastic music, exquisite. No, but yeah, those are my five recordings. I really hope you guys can enjoy them.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Leighton, for joining me in this conversation. It's been such an honor and a pleasure to be able to, hear a little bit about your journey, your opinions about jazz, and I'm especially excited for everybody to hear these tracks that you've chosen. And if anybody wanted to catch up with what you're up to and what you're doing in the future post COVID-19, assumingly.
Mhm.
Where can they find you? What should they look up?
Yeah, you can find me uh, on Instagram. My tag is at Leighton McKinley Harrell, and I also have a website coming. It should be up, by the time, like by the end of the month. And it's just LeightonHarrell.com. So you can check there. I'll be posting whenever I'm back on the bandstand. I don't know when that will be, but I'll be posting when my gigs are, and yeah, so you can find me there.
Cool. Thank you so much, Lane, and hope you have a great evening.
All right, you too.